Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the very last VCs at UC Davis of the quarter. I hope everyone is geared up and ready for finals. Stay mentally healthy and nice and focused out there. But it is my pleasure today to introduce Alan Taylor. Alan is the managing director of Endeavor Catalyst, a venture firm. Well, I don't want to tell what it's focused on because it's actually an interesting story. I'm going to let Alan do that. But Alan, before we dive into the world of venture capital and as you see it, would you mind sharing with us just a bit about your background, what you studied, where you studied, how in the world you got involved in the world of startup investing?
Sure, Aaron, happy to, and thanks for having me. Hello to everyone out there in Zoom world. I'm American. I grew up here in Northern California, and actually went to undergrad back east. So I like to say I studied abroad in New Jersey, from my native California culture first. But after undergrad at Princeton, where I studied languages, so nothing to do with venture capital or even business for that matter. I was a German literature major with a Spanish and Portuguese minor. I ended up living and working after graduation, kind of getting a nonprofit set up in Latin America that was called Princeton in Latin America, or PILA, essentially a postgraduate fellowship organization. And that was a really interesting kind of job experience and life experience because, what I did in that role was interact with, a couple hundred different nonprofit organizations all across Central and South America, and try to kind of place recent North American college grads into those nonprofit groups. And I bring it up because, that was kind of where I started my career, was in, kind of how do you change the world? How do you go find like-minded people who want to solve big problems? And over, I felt sort of frustrated by the fact that the nonprofit world seemed kind of very much, I'll date myself, but this is like, 2003, 2004, full of people who wanted to do good things, but who didn't necessarily have the skills or the tools to do them in a really effective way. And so I got very interested in this idea of how come you couldn't take some of the efficiency and effectiveness and the skills and the networks of the private sector and try to harness them and direct them more towards a social goal or a social good, right? So that's really my background. I did, over that period of time, end up living and working in Argentina. So I speak fluent Spanish. I also spent a year on a Fulbright after college in Berlin, Germany. So I speak some German. But I came to the organization that I work at today, Endeavor, in 2006, 3 years out of college, and thought I would work here for 2 or 3 years. And I've been here for 15. So we can talk more about why and what that all means. But that's really where my background comes from.
Awesome. Well, so Alan, let's do just that. Can you tell us high level first, what Endeavor's up to and why in the world in today's day and age would you stick with an organization for 15 years? That's uncommon anymore.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, look, Endeavor is a super unique organization. It's a nonprofit model, but that really tries to harness the best of the business world for the goals of economic development and job creation. So if you think about it, we're focused on trying to sort of create the jobs of the future in emerging markets and underserved communities all over the world today. So when I first came to Endeavor in 2006, it was largely a Latin America focused organization, presence in countries like Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Mexico. Today, we're in more than 40 countries in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, but also working in communities in Europe and here in the US. But I'll tell you a little bit about what we do and how we focus. We believe entrepreneurs actually are the engine of economic progress and growth, right? So if you want to think about how to create, millions of jobs for the next decades to come, our lens is it's not about government, it's not about policy, it's not about big institutions, it's about entrepreneurs. And so we try to find the very best men and women, the very most talented entrepreneurs in all these places, and then select them into a network of mentors, investors, and partners who can really catalyze what they're doing and help them grow their companies. And so if you think about kind of the high level idea behind all this, and Endeavor was started back in 1997 by a woman named Linda Rotenberg, who's the co-founder, who's still our CEO today. So, she's my boss. I was talking to her about an hour ago. Endeavor really thinks that, if you can find these amazing entrepreneurs, they're going to build big companies. Therefore, they're going to create wealth and create jobs and ultimately kind of become role models for the next generation, hopefully, of entrepreneurs, right? So this is kind of like, if you think kind of in decades, how do you create long-term systemic change in these places? You bring more entrepreneurs and more dynamism to the economy. And Endeavor's core business is around creating a network of peers and mentors to really help those entrepreneurs. What I've built at Endeavor, and it's been a big part of why I've stayed for so long, is about 10 years ago, we actually built sort of a venture capital arm layered on top of the core business, right? And so if you think about what is Endeavor, people say, well, Endeavor is a network, right? It's a mentoring organization. It has this very particular theory of change around entrepreneurs changing the world, but it's mostly about connecting really high quality people with other awesome people. Endeavor Catalyst is a venture capital fund kind of owned and operated by Endeavor and built on top of Endeavor. And we can talk more about kind of why we built that and why I think venture capital is this really interesting tool to kind of get leverage on these situations. But it's all to say, I didn't start out thinking I was going to be a venture capitalist when I grew up, right? Like I have definitely a path of coming to this through economic development and through entrepreneurship.
Well, so Alan, you keep anticipating my questions. I'm just going to let you interview yourself because I did want to ask about Endeavor with these different pieces. So you're managing a venture fund. That's not everything Endeavor does. Maybe you can help us understand a little better why that matters, that Endeavor does all these different things and where the fund fits into all of these pieces.
Yeah, well, look, in Silicon Valley lands today, you get a lot of people talking about, well, we are value add investors, right? We're more than money. Like we have a checkbook, but we also do these other things to help you, which is true, which is great, actually. And I think the fact that there's a lot of investors who now do a lot of other things to help the companies is a very, very positive development versus 20 or 30 years ago when the investors really were just more financial in nature. But Endeavor is like almost the absolute inverse if you think about where it came from, because for 15 years, from 97 till 2010, 2011, all we did was the value add, right? We didn't have a checkbook. We were not investors. We just did help with mentoring, help with talent, help getting good people in your company, help expanding, help going to new markets, right? Thinking through the challenges of how to really scale and grow a company. And I guess I should note, if people want to check it out, our website, which is just endeavor.org, O-R-G, has a lot of detail on like the programs we run and how we think about it. But essentially, we believe that this is about helping founders solve some of those hardest challenges they have as they scale, right? And that's one thing that's important about Endeavor's focus. Lots of different groups these days are focused on startups. And startups obviously is where it all has to start. But we think the biggest outcomes are actually determined by helping a smaller number of successful startups actually achieve scale. And so Endeavor is focused industry agnostic, right? Lots of different kinds of companies and very global in geography, but very focused stage-wise on companies that have already sort of found product market fit and are really ready to scale because they have different challenges and honestly just very, very different needs in terms of the kind of help that they need at that stage of growth. We used to say that was for companies that were 2, 3, 4 years old, but the world goes much faster now. So you can actually be at scale up stage in 6, 8, 10 months if you find product market fit very early on. and have kind of these other accelerators and groups that really encourage you to go faster early. But to your question, Aaron, it's important to point out, Endeavor is a big existing nonprofit entity with kind of affiliate chapters in all the countries where we work. And so, if you think about what we are today, we're about 550 full-time employees, annual operating budget of about $60 million, spread out across these 40 different countries. Right? So it's a very distributed organization. It's very locally owned and operated about how we think about it. So it's not that we sit in New York or San Francisco and think we know all the answers. We provide a framework and a brand to an amazing team in Brazil, for example, who then decides how do they really implement and run the Endeavor program most successfully in the Brazilian context, right? I think that's kind of in many ways, with our venture capital fund, we're just kind of the little tip of this very big iceberg, right? That is Endeavor that's been built over the last 2 decades. But for the fund itself, we really do believe that not only supporting the companies and mentoring them and helping them connect with great people, but actually having skin in the game and writing a check and making an investment in the business is a really great way to support the companies, to support the founders, but also to signal to the wider world just how serious we are about building these businesses and that they're real businesses, right? And that they're not like a nonprofit project or something, but that actually, in fact, this is a way to make money by investing in the very best founders in these emerging and underserved markets.
Awesome. Before we keep going, I just want to remind everyone in the audience that at any point you feel free to digitally raise your hand if you have questions. We want to make sure we hear from everybody. So don't wait for an opportunity in the break. Go ahead and raise your hand. We'll call you as time allows. But Alan, so before we launched the meeting today, you were explaining to me how Endeavor Catalyst is not an impact investor. Can you explain to us what first an impact investor is and why you would not categorize your work in that same category?
Yeah, so look, I think impact investing is a pretty broad term, sort of an umbrella term that does cover a lot of different scenarios. But broadly understood, impact investment has come up over the last 2 decades in a movement, in a way, that says, hey, we want to be double or triple bottom line in the investments that we make. And so in every time we think about making an investment, we're going to evaluate the financial bottom line, but we're also going to evaluate an additional either environmental goal or social goal around something, right? Whether that's around, healthcare or education or underserved populations. But essentially, we're going to score every investment opportunity for both its financial merit and its kind of social impact. And my view is, while very noble in its kind of pursuit, my personal experience is that that's pretty dang hard to do. Like, it's actually very difficult, and you can kind of do it within a portfolio of companies. But when you're asked to do it on a single investment level, one ultimately trumps the other, right? Either you're really doing this for financial gain or you're really doing it for the impact. And the double bottom line approach has a tension in it that's actually very hard to deal with operationally, right? Philosophically, it makes all the sense in the world. And so when you first hear about it, you're like, that's amazing, that's great. You read fancy glossy brochures of impact investment, like do well and do good at the same time. Sounds amazing. Hard to execute in reality. And a lot of the impact funds, I think, are finding that, unfortunately, with venture capital and this type of private company investing, right, the learning periods are long. So you don't figure it out in a year or two. You figure it out in like 5, 7, 10 years later, when either it's like, crap, none of these companies actually made any money at all, or we kind of leaned the other way and we did great on the financial part, but we didn't even come close on any of the social goals, right? So, and there are some impact investors who are succeeding because they've built enough of a portfolio of both to kind of try to manage that. But I do think operationally, execution-wise, it's a hard thing to do. What we're doing is a little bit different. We have built a very much for-profit venture fund, unapologetic in that it's for-profit as Sequoia or Excel or anybody else you would find in the venture capital world. But then what we do with the proceeds of the money that we make is we actually take 50% of them. We take half of all the money and we donate it back to Endeavor, the nonprofit. So we think we've actually created sort of an interesting and clever way to fulfill a lot of the same ambitions that impact investors have, right? Of saying, hey, we want to make money and we want to do good. But we've done it in a way that doesn't ever create any weird sort of tension for us in which one are we trying to do, right? So as Endeavor, we're trying to find and select and support the very best entrepreneurs because we think they'll create the jobs of the future. As Endeavor Catalyst, we have unique access to get to invest in those companies because of Endeavor's relationship, but our goal is only to maximize sort of the financial return so we can then turn around and use that to create the long-term sustainability of the nonprofit itself.
Awesome. Well, so you mentioned earlier the Endeavor Catalyst Fund is industry agnostic, but I am curious, are there some industries you've leaned more into or technologies you're more interested in? Is there something in common with the entrepreneurs that get you most excited and are most likely to win an investment from you?
Yeah, so let's see. Two good questions in there to unpack. On the last one, is there something in common with the founders? Absolutely. They are special, right? They are sort of visionary, kind of live in the future type individuals that, you know, really, if you think about the philosophical underpinning of what we're doing, this is the remarkable individual theory of societal change, right? We're saying, hey, there's 200 million people in Indonesia. At least 200 of those people must be really remarkable, like really special, just in kind of their, you know, what they bring to the world and their ability to really be leaders, right? To attract other people to their cause. Because if you think about successful CEOs of startups that become scale-ups, that become big companies, they tend to have a lot of kind of innate and intrinsic leadership qualities because they attract other people to come work with them, other people to invest in them, people to be their clients, people to bet on them in all these crazy ways. So if, you know, today there are a little over 2,000 Endeavor entrepreneurs around the world out of, you know, I think more than 100,000 that we've screened, right? So only like the top 2% of founders that we meet ultimately become part of Endeavor's network. But it really doesn't matter if you're in Jakarta or Lagos or Detroit. They all have this same quality of, like, you meet them and in 5 minutes you're like, whoa, that person's amazing, you know? And so I think to the second part of your question, there's very much something in common with all the founders, all the men and women that we back. What types of businesses they're building and what industries they operate in, you know, it's true that we are sort of agnostic, but what's really interesting by being agnostic is we're more like a mirror being held up to society in all these different places of like, well, where are the big opportunities? Where are entrepreneurs going and building really big companies? And so then in our own portfolio as a venture fund, you can start to see these really interesting trends of what's happening kind of out on the frontier of venture capital in emerging markets, not because we're saying, you know, we're smarter than everybody else and we know fintech is going to be amazing, but because we're saying we're going to go find the best entrepreneurs and back them in whatever they're doing. And it turns out like technology disrupting financial services, you know, whether that's payments or lending or whichever sort of subsector of finance, is an absolutely huge opportunity where we're seeing a ton of disruption, right? And so, you know, we've been investing now as a fund for about 9 years, and we have done a few retrospective studies to try to look back at like, well, yeah, what sectors actually sort of come first in these different emerging markets, and then what comes next and what comes after that. And we have almost a little bit of an in-house theory about kind of waves of technology, particularly in international markets. And you can map these out for the US and for China and India, which are places we don't work. But then you can map it out in a very real way in our portfolio for Latin America, for Southeast Asia, for the Middle East, that the first wave is always consumer. So it's all consumer and retail focused technology disruption. Think about e-commerce and things like that. The second wave is where you start to get tech disrupting the biggest existing industries. So financial services, healthcare, education, transportation. It's a little bit slower to come, but agriculture, right? So you get all these buzzwords from it: fintech, ag tech, ed tech, health tech, right? But that all comes kind of in the second wave in these markets. And then the third wave, which I think is actually the biggest, most interesting one, is essentially the digitalization of the SME economy, right? So think about millions of small businesses in markets like Pakistan or Turkey or Nigeria that are totally offline in like the way they do everything today, and all the sort of services and products and everything that they use to kind of engage in the world becoming digital. Some of those markets are going to be captured by global products, right? Like think about the amount of commerce taking place in emerging markets on WhatsApp, right? There's like global tools that are going to capture it, but a whole bunch of it is going to be captured by innovative, country-specific or sort of local custom-specific things for digitizing sort of the B2B economy. But it only comes later, right? It's not in Southeast Asia yet really at all. It's not really in the Middle East. It's starting to come to Brazil. But again, this is Endeavor's very particular focus on looking at venture capital in emerging markets. I think we can really see sort of trends, across and between the different markets.
One of the hardest things in my experience in venture capital is, understanding how to time I don't want to say time the investments. What I really mean is that, sometimes startups, great tech, but they're too early or they were too late. And so as you talk about these different waves kind of rushing over various countries, how do you think about timing when a startup is too early or too late to market?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Because it's timing as an investor, when do you bet? But it's also timing as a founder, right? So if you're a really talented person and you're working at Google in Singapore, but you see a big opportunity in Indonesia to start a new business, how do you know if it's too early or if it's exactly the right moment, right? And I'll be very honest with you, Aaron, and with everybody on the call. Some of it is luck, right? And it's very true. Like serendipity definitely plays a role here because, you could take examples of like startup founder X who started a company and worked at it for 5 years, then it crashed and burned because literally the market wasn't ready yet for that particular business. And startup founder Y who started the same thing the next year and it took off like a rocket ship. Some of that is just luck and serendipity, right? But if you're trying to think as a potential founder, as an investor, when are markets ready, there is some amount of learning that you can take from other geographies or other technologies, right? And so in the US only context, people do this all the time of saying like, well, is this, is the, adoption of this particular technology going to happen over the next 5 years? And they'll study a bunch of adjacent or analogous technologies to try to figure it out, right? In our case, we do think that you can kind of predict which business models and which technologies are going to come next to, say Mexico by studying what's been going on in Brazil, right? Because there's been just about an 18-month lag in almost every successful business model we've seen be built in Mexico that, you had an analog in Brazil. So again, you can do a lot of research. You can try to study as much as you can, but frankly, a little bit of it is luck and timing. And what it really comes down to is not at the scale-up phase where we play, but at the startup phase, how fast can you learn, right? How fast can you kind of run experiments and iterate and try things? And, there is this phrase in Silicon Valley of fail fast or, welcome failure. That's not because failure is good, right? Nobody's actually saying like, yeah, I failed. but learning is good, right? And the faster you can iterate and run projects and learn things, the more you'll actually have a sense of like, okay, that works, but that doesn't. This works, but that doesn't. So, I think the interesting thing when you actually work in this industry is underneath the hood of like every successful company that's like IPOing on the New York Stock Exchange, there's a bunch of crazy pivots and turns and messy things and near-death experiences, right? Like, it's not that everybody knows the answers from the beginning.
That makes a ton of sense. Well, so Alan, you bring up another question implicitly here in all these stories you tell of operating in whether it's Brazil or Mexico or India, Indonesia, whatever it might be. I'm really curious. So a lot of venture firms, very few venture firms go, across country lines. Can you tell us a bit about this idea of operating an international investment firm, working with countries in different or companies in different countries? What's exciting about that? What is really hard about that? How do you think about working with companies overseas?
Yeah, so maybe I'll talk a little bit about why, and then share some stories of actually doing it. But the reason I think most investors focus on, say, the US, or most Bay Area, Silicon Valley investors are very focused just on Silicon Valley or, Silicon Valley, Seattle, LA, New York. It really has to do with the fundamentals of how venture is built as a business, right? So you raise a fund, you get 2 or 3 years to invest the capital, and most of these funds are 10-year funds. So within the next, 6 or 7 years, you hope to return the capital to your LPs, to the people who invested with you. And the place where there's a lot of history and a lot of predictability to there being exits and liquidity events and IPOs and acquisitions and the things that will allow you to return that capital is the US, right? There's also now pretty well-established history of doing that in a few international markets like China or like Israel or like some parts of Western Europe. But for the most part, 10 years ago, when we were raising a fund saying we're going to bet on Brazil and Indonesia and South Africa and Turkey, people looked at us like we had 3 heads, right? Because they're like, well, okay, I believe you, there are good entrepreneurs there, and that's great that Endeavor's helping them. But in terms of like running a venture fund and making money, there's not going to be any exits. Like, where are the exits going to come from, right? There's no track record of big acquisitions or IPOs or things like that. And so, again, 9-10 years ago, that was definitely a little bit of a bet, right, that we were going to do that. Today, there are actually a number of firms starting to follow suit and get more active, and you're seeing more specialized firms in, say, Brazil or Latin America focused just on that region. And you're seeing global firms diversify their own investing by having still probably the lion's share of their investments in the US, but starting to really see there's a big opportunity for diversification by investing into some of these other markets. But, frankly, when it comes to the economics of running a venture fund in particular, you have to believe that some of the businesses you invest in really will have these outsized outcomes, right? Will become like enormously successful, because ventures, it's a power law business, right? You really do need things that can be worth, hundreds of millions, billions, tens of billions of dollars that will essentially return your whole fund 2, 3, 4 times over, and it won't even matter what happened with all your other investments, And so that's the thing where up until recently, it was hard to believe that was going to happen in emerging markets. But we've been very fortunate. Some of the initial companies we invested in back in those, 2011, 2012 days when we were getting started, one was called Globant from Argentina that eventually listed on the New York Stock Exchange and today is an $8 billion company, right? Another one was called Peak Games out of Turkey. That was a mobile gaming company, sort of like Zynga, but based in Istanbul, and had really good local talent of game builders and programmers in Istanbul, Turkey. It turns out they made enough successful titles and enough money and built a real kind of creative studio engine that finally last year, about 9 months ago, Zynga acquired Peak Games for $1.8 billion, right? And those people who a decade ago were looking at us like we were crazy, like, you can't do that in Turkey, were writing us back saying like, well, I guess you guys proved us wrong, and that's what we're trying to do, is show like you can build these really big, amazing companies anywhere. Well, here, I'll give you a little more of a broader view there, because that is one really good example of Peak Games that was a recent exit. But we are seeing a lot of companies, again, in those same waves that we talked about, sort of consumer and then fintech, health tech, ed tech. We now have in our portfolio, I guess to give you guys some numbers, we're on our third venture fund, right? So we've raised 3 funds now over the years. The vintages are 2011 was sort of when we started with the pilot project of investing some donated money. 2014 is our first fund. 2017 is our second fund. 2020 is the vintage of sort of starting our third fund. And remember, it's a long-term game, right? Each one of these funds are 10 years long. And so we're actually not even completely done with our first fund yet. So, but in those portfolios, those companies I just referenced, Globon and Peak Games, they're in that kind of first fund where, thanks to the success of those 2 businesses and a third one out of Turkey called Yemek Sepeti, that was a food delivery business, like a DoorDash for Turkey, that was acquired for about $600 million a couple of years ago. Thanks to the success of really those 3 companies, our first fund has now returned capital 7 times over, right? It's like a 7x fund and still growing because we still have more companies in there. To give you a sense, that makes it sort of a top 5%, maybe even like top 3% performing venture fund for the entire asset class. And our goal or ambition is to be at least a top decile fund, every single fund, right? Be in the top 10% of the industry, fund over time. Because if we can do that, we can sort of prove to the world that you can do this in emerging markets, But Anastasia, to your question, when we started, our real ambition was to say, hey, can we get one company from Endeavor Catalyst portfolio to be valued at $1 billion? And for those of you who are, in the startup world and read TechCrunch every day and stuff, you'll know the whole popularization of the term unicorn has taken over like a wave in the last few years, right? So we were talking about unicorns before Aileen Lee coined the term, before they called them unicorns, but we were basically, our goal was like, hey, can we get one unicorn, right, from all these countries where we're working? As of this week, I guess, when one of our fintech financial service companies in Nigeria called Flutterwave, which is just an awesome company for Africa, raised a new round of capital, valuing it at $1 billion, so it became a Nigerian unicorn. That is our 17th unicorn so far in emerging markets, right? And so it's far exceeded even our own expectations in terms of the scale to which these companies can grow. But of those 17 kind of really big outlier success stories, a number of them are in consumer-facing things. So services that we use in the U.S. every day, like DoorDash or like Uber or Lyft, exist in these other markets, and we're investors in them, right? In Latin America, it's a company called Rappi. There's also a business out of Spain called Glovo that are both sort of these deliver everything kind of innovative consumer apps. We supported as Endeavor, and we invested in a business from the Middle East called Careem that was a lot like Uber for Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon and Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And, as will happen in some of these places, the really big international player ultimately will buy the local regional player. So Careem was actually acquired by Uber 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, for $3 billion, right? And essentially, a lot of the things we're seeing in our markets are parallel to some of the technologies and business models we're seeing in the US. But to be very open with you guys, a lot of them also really mirror the way things have developed in China or the way things have developed in India, which oftentimes are different than what we're seeing in the US. And so it's really interesting to kind of watch all those different trends and patterns.
Well, so Alan, your office is here in Northern California. We've hardly done any traveling in the last year. How do you find these companies all over the planet? It's one thing when you're, on Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley and you just go across the street and find a dozen new great startups, but to find them overseas, how do you do that?
Well, so Aaron, I think to your earlier question of like, why aren't more people doing this? I think this is why, right? It's hard, right? If you're just a few people at an office in California or in New York, how do you know? How do you find them? How do you know who's good? That's where I think, to be just very open about it, like we have a super unfair advantage as Endeavor Catalyst because we're built on top of Endeavor, right? Because in our case, we find them through this very rigorous selection process that Endeavor's running in all of our markets. I was talking last night to our team in Vietnam. We set up an office in Vietnam about 2 years ago, so it's a new office for us. We have a full-time team of 6 people. All they're trying to do is find the best entrepreneurs for Endeavor to support, right? And when they get selected into the network, they then become eligible for us to make an investment in them, right? And so in a way, I have like the coolest, best, easiest job in the world because my 500 team members at Endeavor are sourcing and selecting all these amazing companies, and then I get to show up and write a small check, right? So it's super unique. No, you couldn't build it this way if you were building a venture fund from scratch, because you would never have the budget to have 500 team members, right? It's a very unique setup that Endeavor already existed and was already funded by philanthropy and really wanted to, do this themselves. I should say do it ourselves to make Endeavor self-sustaining. Because that's the other angle on this if you're interested in kind of nonprofit models or economic development is, Endeavor has been funded over the years by hundreds of millions of dollars of private philanthropy, right? People like Piero Midiar, the original founder of eBay, Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, Michael Dell. These guys have donated tens of millions of dollars to help fund Endeavor's program. But our goal within the next 5 to 7 years is that our entire program, our social sort of mission-oriented nonprofit program, will be financially independent and will not need donations and will be supported by the success of Endeavor Catalyst, making money and kind of donating it back.
Wow, that's amazing. I love this focus on the unfair advantage. It's a pretty dang good one. Well, Alan, I mean, not to kind of begin to wrap on a dour note, but I'm curious, what are some of the challenges your startups face? Are there any, common missteps they make or things that they face that are difficult regularly? And if so, what are some of the ways you've seen these startups overcome those challenges successfully?
Oh yeah, there are tons. So don't get me wrong. I'm an optimist and I'm a very positive guy, but the work of being a startup founder or, early on a startup team, it is some of the most fulfilling, exciting, awesome work in the world, but it is some of the hardest, right? It is crazy hard to go to work every day trying to solve a problem with no roadmap for how you do it. And the risk that you take is really tremendous. I mentioned Reid Hoffman, who started LinkedIn, and Reid actually is the chairman of our fund and somebody I really look up to and feel like I've learned the venture business from over the last 10 years. After being a successful entrepreneur, he became a partner at Greylock. But Reid's analogy is, he says, being a startup founder, there's that old thing about jumping out of an airplane without a parachute. But Reid, I think, makes it even better. He says, no, being a startup founder is like jumping out of an airplane with a backpack full of silkworms and hoping they're overachievers, right? And that to me is totally what those first couple of years of running a startup feel like, right? It's like you think you're going somewhere amazing, but holy shit, there's no safety net and you don't know if it's going to work or not. That is a certain type of stress that some people find really exhilarating. and other people are like, absolutely not, get me as far away from that work environment as I can get, you know. But to your actual question, Aaron, you know, Endeavor has now worked with, like I say, about 2,000 founders over these last 20 years. And we've spent a lot of time trying to sort of categorize and sort what the challenges are. And there's other organizations that can do this too, right? If you go to Y Combinator, they've got great lessons for really early stage companies on like, what are the same mistakes everybody makes? And here's the things you need to know. And YC actually shares a lot of this pretty publicly, which is cool to go like watch their videos and see some of the content they put out. You know, we consider them kind of the gold standard for early stage companies and early stage entrepreneurs. And Endeavor really plays sort of after them, right? So it's very complementary to what they're doing. And they have a great thing, actually. They say at the startup phase, 30% of everything you need to know to build a company is the same. 70% is highly bespoke and customizable based on your sector, your industry, your problem, whatever. But there's this 30% that's exactly the same every time. So here, just read this and then go do that part this way, right? So you don't have to make any of those mistakes. And that's things like how to incorporate your company and how to set up the legal structure and, you know, some of those things that really don't need to get reinvented. That's that whole thing about know where to innovate, right? Innovative thinkers try to innovate everywhere. It's like, no, here, innovate over here. These things, just do them the way everybody does them, right? That's going to be much better. But when you get up to the stage Endeavor's playing at on kind of helping companies scale, you know, you can take sort of hundreds of different challenges and obstacles, and we think you can kind of boil them down into three big buckets, right? And that's actually how we've built most of our core programming, is around helping entrepreneurs with access to talent, right? Getting the right talented people working in the business and on the business, right? That's on your board of directors, on your management team, but also just sort of in the ranks of your company. Access to smart capital, and that's where all this came from, around like using venture capital as a lever for helping these companies accelerate their growth. You know, I talk to entrepreneurs a lot around, you know, should I raise money or not? You know, our business is profitable. We don't need the money. I always say, look, ultimately that decision is about sort of how fast do you want to grow and how big do you want to be, right? And if you bring in the right capital partners with the right expertise, they will amplify your rate of growth and the ultimate magnitude of your success, right? And those are really the things that I think for entrepreneurs really dreaming big, they're attracted to that. And that's why you see them raising outside capital, is this idea of like, wow, we can build something really, really big. But look, raising capital is not easy at all. And it feels very glamorous when you're reading TechCrunch, but the reality is there's tons and tons of companies who fail to raise money for every one that makes it into the article, right? And so, and even some of the, you know, I talked about having 17 unicorns. Some of the billion-dollar companies we support had stages of their growth where they couldn't raise any money, right? Where nobody believed in them, where 50 people said no. Like, that's all very real. So access to capital, I think, is a very real challenge and continues to be. Even in an environment where there's lots of capital out there, it's a super inefficient marketplace. And I don't think we've yet gotten to a place where capital's really in the hands of sort of efficient, effective allocators when it comes to unproven technologies or unproven geographies. And then the last one is access to markets, which you guys can imagine all the reasons that is hard. But, you know, many businesses to reach scale have to go beyond their home city or home country. And, you know, the first time that you, let's say, you know, you started out in Bogota, Colombia, and now you expanded to Mexico, but now you have to expand into the US. You know, it's a whole different ballgame, different competitive landscape, different sort of dynamics, different pricing, different customer set. And so I think, you know, if you wanted to, we could have a whole hour just on startup life challenges, right? There's tons of challenges, but understanding how to understand those challenges and how and where to seek help, because that's ultimately, you know, to end it on more of a positive note, what I think is amazing about the community of entrepreneurs within Endeavor, but really just what entrepreneurs are like as a community, is that it is very much a help first, give first, kind of pay it forward type culture. And, that's one of the magic things about Silicon Valley, is that people really act that way. But I find that's one of the magical things about real entrepreneurs everywhere, is that they don't view this as a zero-sum game. They really believe that by sort of sharing your challenges and sharing your opportunities, everybody does better.
Awesome, Alan, I appreciate it. Well, folks, we are right at the end of the time. We got just a couple minutes left. So Alan, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate the time again. Alan Taylor from Endeavor Catalyst, an investor in startups around the world and making a big difference. So thank you for joining us, Alan, and everybody. Best of luck again with your last couple classes and finals. Go rock and roll and enjoy spring break.